The Cows, back, very quick turnaround, just finished one broadcast, and we are here for the second program for Sunday, November 15th. I did want to mention quickly before we get started, Dr. Frances Cress-Welsing, she was on The Truth Will Out yesterday evening. Please make sure you check that out. Very constructive program, Truth Will Out here at Blog Talk Radio. Just go to the site and look at the archive. Should be there for Saturday, November 14th. You'll see Dr. Frances Cress-Welsing, but she was on the program last night. You can check that out. And if you did not catch, Mr. Neely Fuller Jr. was on the Cows this past Friday, November 13th. The audio, new phone, my incompetence showed. I was not able to correct the three-way on the phone until about 20 minutes into the program. So just fast forward through the first 20 minutes, and then you should hear the broadcast. No further problems or anything. But Neely Fuller was here Friday. You can check that out. And Dr. Frances Cress-Welsing was here yesterday. Well, not here, excuse me, on The Truth Will Out yesterday. Moving forward, next program, or the current program we're doing, if you've been following the Cows, we had two authors from The Color of Wealth on the program since the end of September. In September, we had Meiju Lee on the program. She shared a lot of insightful information about the racial wealth gap. And just last Sunday, we had the admitted racist known as Betsy Leandar Wright, also one of the co-authors of The Color of Wealth. She was here. Pretty interesting program, and what she shared with us. That book cites our guest for today's program, cites his work. They actually cited a different book, Black Wealth, White Wealth, which is also very interesting, but the book we're going to focus on today, The Hidden Cost of Being African American. Very interesting book to have someone really break down and analyze the gap between being a white person, being a black person, particularly when you go out to try to get a home and that type of thing, and looking at how this plays out in terms of your quality of life. Very interesting. Real privilege to have our guest on the program. He is in the Department of Sociology at Brandeis University. Our guest for program number 2 today is Professor Thomas Shapiro. Professor Shapiro, are you with us?
I am. It is a great pleasure to be so.
Thank you. We are privileged to have you. For folks, hopefully, once they're done with this program, they will run out and get The Hidden Cost of Being African American, and also check out Black Wealth, White Wealth. But for folks who are not familiar with those works, could you share something about yourself so they have a better idea of who you are?
Sure. I am, among other things, I am a professor at the Heller School at Brandeis University, where I've been there now about 6.5 years. I have been a professor since 1978 and have been specializing, if you will, in racial inequality and social justice issues. I've been privileged from my first collaboration with Melvin Oliver that resulted in the book Black Wealth, White Wealth, and that was published now about 14 years ago or so. We were able to come out with a second edition a couple of years ago that added a couple of new chapters. But I've been a professor now for about, I hate to admit it, about 31 years, and have been interested in issues of social justice, especially class, race, and gender issues and the intersection thereof. But in addition to being a professor, I also direct an institute at Brandeis University called the Institute on Assets and Social Policy that allows me to have a little more fun by making a little more trouble. It allows me to get engaged with a number of community-based organizations, both ones that are local to Boston and the Massachusetts area, as well as some national organizations as well, to essentially pursue the ideas that I hold very deeply and that have sort of resulted from the evidence of my work, to go about the business of sort of trying to tackle the so what question of how one goes about making or attempting to make the kinds of changes that some of us think are important. So in a quick nutshell, that's my professional biography. I grew up on the West Coast in Los Angeles. Went to college at the University of Wisconsin, did my PhD work at Washington University in St. Louis. I've been living with my beautiful wife, Ruth, in Boston for about 31 years now. One dog, one cat, and one young adult child who's a sophomore in college.
Outstanding. I don't think there's anything to be in the least bit disgruntled about 30 years of being a professor. I think that's pretty impressive, I will say. I wanted to double check, because this is real important for the work that you do. You are a white male, is that correct?
Yes, I am.
Okay. I found it very interesting to have a white person writing this book and really, in my view, revealing a lot of accurate, honest information about racism in the hidden cost of being African American. So very important. This particular program, I have unfortunately concluded that we are in a global system of racism, white supremacy, and the definition that I use for both racism and white supremacy is a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white. Do you believe that such a system exists, and do you think that definition is accurate?
Well, I certainly think the core of what you're talking about and the conceptual core is certainly there and certainly exists, and there's a lot of, if you will, a lot of evidence of it over time. And I, as a professor, I don't want to quibble about definitions. The definition may be a little too all-encompassing. I'm not sure all white people and all non-white people. I'm not sure that that's a line. I think that line gets hopefully more blurred as time goes along, and as sort of there is a more coming of age of consciousness. But I know exactly where you're coming from with it.
Okay. I am not aware of any non-white people who are not subject to the white people who practice racism. Are you saying that there are non-white people who are not subject to the system of racism?
No. I think everybody, unless we're living on an island by ourselves somewhere, and maybe we can even debate about that. But I think everybody is involved in, as you were putting in, a global system, a system that involves even the most benign actions in ways that we don't often consider very much into the future. So yeah, I think that's accurate.
Okay. And I want to point this out, but noting trends with the white guests who've come on this program, a significant number of them have quibbled about saying that all white people do not do this, and I have to consistently point out, I never said all white people. I just said that the people who run this system classify themselves as white and do some other things. So it's not just being white, it's being white and dedication to making sure white people dominate non-white people worldwide.
Right. You know, what's interesting, part of that that's interesting to me is when we interviewed close to 200 families for the hidden cost of being African American, and about half of them were white. And one of the things that we were struck by, we're struck by a lot of things, but one of the little surprises for me, certainly in terms of the depth and the passion of it, was the denial of privilege. People sort of taking the core of the American dream and wrapping the loose values of that in their own life story in ways that would justify inheritance, for example, as something that was earned and deserved, as opposed to something that was given to them. I'm sorry about the dog in the background.
His 2 cents. There we go.
Yeah. No, he'll calm down. So the power of that denial, and which is the flip side, of course, of the lack of consciousness, the lack of understanding of where one fits into a system and how sort of behaviors and incentives can be racialized without perhaps it being intended so, runs extremely deep in American society, and I presume globally as well. I don't know as much globally as I think I do about America.
Mm. Okay. Cool. I'm very much looking forward to getting into the meat of the book. I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I'm hoping our listeners will get some constructive value out of it. I know I did. My co-host, she is a non-white female, a victim of racism, white supremacy, and she is at the ripe old age of 10. But she is also trying to get constructive information so that we can help correct this problem and establish justice immediately. Justice, are you there? And if you are there, please go right ahead with your questions.
I heard you say social justice. What is your definition of social justice?
Ooh, great question. Too bad I have to answer it right away. For me, social justice has to do with some basic distributional equity and fairness. And that's kind of at the tail end of social justice. Social justice also involves a process that is deeply democratic, equitable, and that results in that kind of equity that I think is really critical. Otherwise, social justice is really it's a tough one to get to me a specific definition around. I teach at a school, for example, that has as sort of our official brand knowledge advancing social justice. And social justice means different things, slightly different things to different people in the school. And I think it's important to be open enough to take the democratic values that people are interested in and let them apply them to the areas that they get more passionate about. So, for example, a lot of my colleagues are interested in healthcare disparities in the United States and globally, and others of us are more interested in issues around race and social justice and economic security. And if you come from it from different passion points like that, the definition one uses of social justice is going to be a little different, but the meaning is really about the same. It's about a process that's deeply democratic, but not just about the rules of the game. It's also about the results. That's what I mean by the distribution of resources that are valued. So I hope that helps, and I hope that wasn't a professor that's been professing for 31 years patronizing a 10-year-old.
What are some suggestions for things non-white people can do to deal with stress of racism?
Well, that's another great question. I'm one that believes the firmer people have some critical insights into where their lives fit in the society. The less that doesn't mean you won't be under stress, but at least it means one is in a much better position to have a handle on the things that are putting stress on them, and to understand which of those, if you will, are coming because of their situation, and which of them, if any, are coming because of their own psychology or how they're reacting to the toxic stress that they face in their everyday lives. So for me, again, the remedy, if you will, starts with a critical understanding of where people are. And ultimately, the only way to transform that is both a reconciliation and a transformation of the sources of stress, that is, the sources of economic injustice and social injustice. And that occurs, unfortunately, all too rarely.
Okay, that'll be all for now.
Thank you very much. You're tough.
I hope she will be getting tougher as hopefully by the time she's 12, she'll be ready to roll.
People won't come on and talk to you.
Hopefully there won't be a need. Hopefully the problem will be corrected and we can retire, and we've already made a deal. We're getting Krispy Kreme milkshakes when we succeed in establishing justice.
I'm in on that.
Everyone can join. It'll be just. So we can all have Krispy Kreme milkshakes when we replace racism with justice. Your book, The Hidden Cost of Being African American, you talk a lot about wealth, and as I said, we already had The Color of Wealth, two of the co-authors of that work on the program. What do you mean when you say wealth?
Well, the traditional definition, if you will, is we want to make a separation of wealth and income. Income is like a stream of resources that we use to mostly replenish our everyday lives. It pays for our clothing, food, shelter, vacations, if those exist, and other things. Whereas wealth is more of a well. It's a well of those stored resources that families, typically in bank accounts, individual retirement accounts, stocks, bonds, cars, homes, jewelry, whatever somebody has of value that can be sold where they can receive some cash or something valuable in return for it. And people use that for a couple of really critical purposes. First, it's used as a nest egg to stave off shocks in one's life, whether it be an economic shock of losing a job or losing hours or losing benefits, or a health shock of a sudden illness that's not covered or not having health insurance, or other kinds of shocks. And typically families think of wanting to have about 3 months' worth of what would be their income in a storehouse. That's sort of their reserve fund. And then on top of that, what wealth is really used for in American society, other than that emergency coffee can function, is the function of it's wealth that helps families get ahead and stay ahead. And by that I mean it's what helps families pay the down payment on a home that may get them to a first home. It may get them to what they consider to be a safer neighborhood. It may get them to what they consider to be a much better school system for their children. It may allow them to buy a business, expand a business. Those are the things that wealth traditionally are used for, and what separates it from income. But there's another way of thinking of wealth, I suppose, as well, and that is wealth is surplus security.
Wow. One of the things that stood out, and there were many that stood out in your work, Professor Shapiro, is you talk at various points throughout the book that when we look at racism and we look at the gap between the wealth that white people have and the wealth that non-white people, in your book you're specifically looking at black people, that there has to be accountability and an understanding that white privilege exists because of the abuse of non-white people, and that we can't just look at this and say, well, all these wonderful trinkets and treats that white people get don't just come from nowhere, don't just come out of thin air. The reason that the white neighborhood or the white schools look so great is directly related to the black schools being so poor and black people having such a tough time. Can you talk about that? And I kind of want to frame as we move forward. I want people to keep that in mind, because I've found that white people are extraordinarily resistant to acknowledging that white privilege is very much based on the abuse of non-white people.
Yeah, I think that is incredibly critical, and also very problematic in the minds of most white people. I like to think about it this way. And I want to illustrate this with what I think is a really important example. At least it's a really large example. If we look, as I have in that book, and other people have as well, if one looks at the house prices in communities that are predominantly white and the housing prices in communities that are integrated or in communities that are predominantly non-white, we see the evidence is very clear. You see a huge difference. Even if you account for or only comparing houses that are the same size, built in the same year, of the same material, on the same size lots, etc. That is, the real physical thing of the house is as close as we can get it to being similar. The differences between that white neighborhood, integrated neighborhood, and non-white neighborhood are very pronounced. All right, so let's ask, why does that exist? It doesn't exist because of the difference in the homes. It exists because of the difference in the communities, or the perceived difference in the communities. And whatever the dollar value difference in those homes and the home appreciation and the home prices, the premium that is the highest value in the dollar terms is in the community that's predominantly white. Now, that's, of course, going to differ on the income levels in the community, but across the board, when you're comparing income levels in communities, the community that is predominantly white has the higher home price value and the higher ceiling on the wealth that is therefore created as those homes appreciate over time. The reason we think that we're pretty well convinced that exists is because if we use the example of buying a home that costs $300,000 that's in a community that's 90% white, we ask ourselves, who can buy that home? The answer really is, for the most part, only those families that can afford a $300,000 home, which is not a whole lot of us. And race may or may not be a factor there, but if we were asked the same question in the community that is, say, 70% African American, we get a very different answer. White people are not going to buy there, for the most part. 95%. That's just a number off the top of my head. There's no study that tells me that, but I would stand behind that number. Most white people aren't going to buy there. So now who can buy there are only those African non-white families that can afford a $300,000 home. So by what the economists would tell us is a simple chart about supply and demand looks like it's a universal process that has no racialized dynamics involved, when in fact we're seeing something profoundly racial, and in fact I think goes to the core of a meaning around structural racism. In that instance, in the community that's predominantly white, if you bought a house there, the value of your home is going to go up more quickly. The ceiling, how much it's going to go up, is going to be higher. And there's going to be a more arbitrary or artificial ceiling on the wealth that's created in your home in a community that's non-white. In the non-white community, if you will, and I hate to use the terminology, so I'm going to put it in parentheses, and I hope your listeners will sort of put quotation marks around it. The victims there, if you will, are the homeowners. And those are people that are primarily non-white. But who are the perpetrators? In the usual way of analyzing that kind of market situation, most people would say, well, there's really no perpetrator, because there's nobody taking that money. There's nobody putting, there's no one to go to arrest. There's no one to go protest against. There's no change to be asked for in very simple terms. But the reality is different. The reality is that the wealth that's created in the community that's predominantly white comes at the expense of less wealth being created in both the integrated community and the community that's predominantly non-white. They are the flip side of the same coin. And that's the dynamic. It may be a little too conceptual for people to think about. It's hard to get one's head around thinking about, especially a situation where there's no one individual or institution responsible for it. So I think most white people would instantly deny that if they're living in a community that's predominantly white, that their homes are going up more in value because it's a white community. They'll talk about, well, other people don't mow their lawns, or they'll come up. We all know what the reasoning tends to be.
Mm. Wow.
And by not so incidentally, in middle class families, the wealth one has created in their homes is about 2/3 of their wealth portfolio. Most Americans don't accumulate wealth in stocks and savings and bonds and crimping and saving and putting relatively small amounts aside every week or every month. It's an institutional process by and large in the United States. So that process that occurs in differentiating home values and home wealth that's generated in those families and communities is really the main engine, if you will, of the racial wealth gap in the United States.
Wow. Again, Professor, is it Dr. Shapiro or Professor?
It's whatever you're most comfortable with. I'm really comfortable with Tom, but I don't.
Okay. We can do Tom, no problem. I wanted to go back to victim because I thought that was very interesting. You said in quotes, I personally have no problem with the term victim. I actually encourage non-white people, highly suggest that they use the term victim because it's accurate. If you, as you pointed out, if you own a home in an area where the white people decide to leave, and non-white people replace them, that's going to have an adverse impact on the value of your home. You are a victim of racism with white people leaving. I don't think there's anything incorrect about it. I feel like that is the most accurate term to use to describe a non-white person in that situation, or many of the other situations that you talk about, just being a non-white person and perhaps not being able to live in a better neighborhood that has better schools and that sort of thing. You are a victim. I think it is completely accurate, and I think it's the best term to use. I don't think it's correct for people to discourage people and say, well, you shouldn't call yourself a victim. That's a defeatist attitude. It's accurate. We just want to talk about this using the most correct terms. Victim is correct. I am a victim of white supremacy. I also wanted to point out, I also think that is very important what you talked about in terms of, I think, both white people and non-white people thinking these type of things happen and there is no perpetrator. There is no one to blame, even if you have so-called white privilege, racism, white supremacy. It just exists. These things happen. The appreciation, the difference in appreciation for white homes and non-white homes. Yeah, it's unfortunate, but there's no one really to blame, and I wholeheartedly disagree with that. There are people who are doing things that are responsible for why that is, and I think that needs to be called out, and people need to be held accountable for it. Specifically, white people need to be held accountable for that, because at the end of the day, there are white people that are doing things that cause non-white homes to not appreciate or to depreciate in value, and white people are leaving these areas and going to white enclaves. We had Rich Benjamin on the program last month. He just wrote Searching for Whitopia, where he went out and stayed with all these white people all over the country, and a lot of them were saying blatantly racist things. I think he said he went to a white church and a white person told him that God said that white people are the apple of his eye. That's in the book that he reported this happened.
Oh dear. Yeah.
People need to be held accountable for that. But pushing forward, you said in the hidden cost of being African American, you talked about 3 particular ways that white people benefit in a system of racism, white supremacy, that really helps explain the gap between the wealth that white people have, and in your book you're specifically talking about black people. One is transformative assets, one is Head Start assets, and one is possessive advantage. Could you break those down for our listeners so they get a really clear understanding of what you're talking about?
Sure. Let me try, and the first two will bleed into each other pretty seamlessly, I think. For me, the notion of transformative assets is a relatively simple one, but one that's really critical and key to the argument that my work tries to make, and that is that transformative asset is wealth that allows a family to buy a house or move into a community or get its kids to a school that family could not afford by its own merits, its own achievement, its own income alone. So there's something that's happened, an inheritance, a loan, a so-called loan from a parent, a grandparent, a guardian aunt, or whomever, that's transformed their lives. It's transformed their lives by allowing them to buy a home, live in a community, have their kids go to school, start a business that their own individual merits and their own paychecks couldn't allow them to do. In the data I was looking at, about 28% of white families have a viable inheritance of some kind. And by viable inheritance of some kind, what I really mean is money between generations is not simply passed at the death of a parent or grandparent, but the second biggest moment in the lives of families that triggers wealth going across generations is when a young couple buys its first home. And because of housing prices in the United States, it's very rare that that family doesn't receive some kind of assistance from family. And if 28% of white families have been in a position to receive such an inheritance, either at death or in vivo before a parent or grandparent dies, that's it's not a majority, but it's a significant number. It puts between a quarter and a third, if you will, of white families having that ability to call transformative assets into being, to kind of catapult their own social mobility. In comparison, about 7.7% of African American families in the data we were looking at have similar capacities for transformative assets or inheritance. And that's about a 4-to-1 ratio. When we looked at how much is inherited by whites and how much is inherited by blacks, we see that sort of 4-to-1 magnitude being extended in a very different kind of direction. The average inheritance of African Americans is about $900. It's not exactly a down payment. It's, I don't know where your listeners are listening from, but in the Boston area, when your car goes over a pothole in the winter and you break an axle or two, that's about that $900 inheritance.
Wow.
The average inheritance for a white family was $10,000.
Wow.
So that's where we start in terms of both the concept of transformative assets and getting down to some numbers that I hope give it a little bit of life. Head Start assets are very similar, but it's really keyed to the children of young adults. Those Head Start assets, in my mind, have to do with, again, the ability for a family to put its children in what most people consider to be a richer educational environment. And I want to be a little careful with that because people can disagree about which educational environment is richer or has more quality and this and that. But if one looks at sort of standard Department of Education criteria around, student-teacher ratio, the technology, the computers involved, how up-to-date the curricula is, the number of administrators per teachers, and things that most educational experts think go into making a higher quality educational environment That's the kind of Head Start, if you will. And I did rip off the phrase from the Head Start program quite intentionally there, I think. That's the kind of Head Start that I'm talking about there. Really involved, the younger children in kindergarten, pre-kindergarten, and up through the first few years in school. Possessive individualism, was that the third one you wanted?
Possessive advantages.
Possessive advantages. My good friend George Lipsitz has written a book called
Possessive Investment.
Possessive Individualism. And I think my turn of the phrase there is around looking at how individual families not only use the wealth that they may have at their command, they use that capacity, but that, and this goes back to our previous conversation, when you use, let me think of an example or two from the book of families we interviewed. When you use inheritance money or money that is given you from your family to make a down payment on a home that you in a community that you otherwise couldn't afford, and the main reason, at least the main stated reason to us, is that it's a safer community, yes, but you really want your kids to have the experience and opportunity in that school system, and that's usually a suburban school system. And not so incidentally, these are families that typically move from communities that have higher percentages of non-whites to communities that have lower percentages of non-whites. And similarly, their kid goes from a school that may have some non-whites to a school that has very few, if any, non-whites in it. That's all part of the process. That possessive advantage is very clear and very palpable to people when they make those decisions and when they talk about it. They're not talking about getting the best education for everybody, but there's a very clear understanding that educational quality is extremely varied in the United States, and that education is probably today, even more so than any time in our past, a ticket to success, or at least a ticket to the opportunities of success. So getting their child and their children a head start on other children, that's the flip side about a privilege and where that comes from, and doesn't just happen in a silo, but it impacts a lot of other people. Possessive advantage has to do then with the very clear sense of wanting to get your kid ahead.
Outstanding. I hope that was very clear. If it was not clear, type it in the chat room, or you can call in, and we'll see if we can get cleared up. But I thought that was very clear, and I thought that was in the book just really illustrates the helping hand that white people often get in terms of inheritance. I did want to read from page 67 before I check on Justice to see if she has some more questions. But on page 67, when you were talking about inheritance and just how much of a boost this gives white people, whether it's getting their kids into better schools or getting access to a house that they might not, otherwise be able to afford. You said that this is during the 1990s, that studies indicate that nearly 1 in 4 white families received an inheritance after the death of a parent, averaging $144,652. In stark contrast, about 1 in 20 African American families had inherited in this way, and their average inheritance amounted to $41,985. Just a gap of about $100,000. And again, that was 1 in 4 white families, as opposed to 1 in 20 for African Americans. Just, we're talking a pretty wide gulf here in terms of the amount of help that white people frequently get from their parents.
Absolutely, and let me, if you don't mind, let me expand upon that. Actually, I want to sort of reel it back and talk about a little pretext to that, which I think is really critical. For me, there are two things that are absolutely critical in thinking about wealth. One is that traditionally in the United States, in the social sciences, when we try and do studies or come to some kind of assessment about the economic relationship among groups, the traditional metric, the traditional measure has been income. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Income tells a lot of the story, not nearly as much of the story as people perhaps should know about. But income doesn't tell us anything about history. It doesn't tell us anything about what happened in the past. It doesn't tell us anything about our parents, our grandparents, our great-grandparents, how people came here, what their opportunities were. Income is not something that is passed along from generation to generation. Wealth is. So in pretty stark reality in some ways, when Melvin Oliver and I were trying to frame a prior book, Black Wealth, White Wealth, that we did together, and we're trying to think about, oh my gosh, there are 30,000 stories here we could tell with the data we're looking at. How do we figure out what the prize is, and then how do you figure out how to keep your eyes on that prize and tell that story? One of the most animating passions for both of us was the notion that bringing wealth into the affirmative action conversation would be the first time that we had the potential of transforming that conversation from something that was political, ideological, and that you really couldn't get very much information or data about. Because after all, the affirmative action debate, I think at its core, is about does that past impact the present and the future? And I don't think we need to string it out about what one side says and what the other side says, but it's basically an argument about the past and what relevant is it for the future. When you start to raise the social science evidence about family wealth, that no longer becomes an abstract conversation. Using wealth has the ability of opening a window to that past. So that when we come up and finally get to march up to data on inheritance, like I mentioned and you really underscored, I don't want to let that pass. I think that's a moment that says, okay, why is that? Why is it that only 1 in 20 African Americans in that particular study inherited a considerable amount of money? And that takes us back to, what were wrong with their parents or grandparents? Weren't they allowed to buy property? No, they weren't. Probably depending on where they were. Weren't they allowed to own businesses? Well, if you were a business owner in Tulsa, Oklahoma in a certain year at the beginning part of the 1900s, yeah, you were, and then you got burned and run out of town. And you can talk about, it's a way of putting history on the table that is not only real, but connects to the present. So that's one of our animating passions around Black Wealth, White Wealth, and was around that kind, being able to bring that kind of conversation to the public agenda around racism and social justice, as well as to the scholarly understanding of inequality in the United States. And I have tried as valiantly as I could to continue that and take it in a different direction in the hidden cost of being African American.
As I said, I found a wealth of constructive information in the hidden cost of being African American, and I'm probably going to be checking out Black Wealth, White Wealth very soon. my co-host, she says she's ready for questions. Justice, go right ahead.
Where can non-white people go for help when they experience racism, white supremacy?
Another tough question. I think it's going to depend. My answer on that is it depends on the injustice that they face. If it's because I think there are, in fact, we need to do a whole lot better job with this. But if there are injustices, for example, that people feel they're facing in healthcare, there are organizations that are advocates for more equitable healthcare and the ending of healthcare disparities in the United States. So I think there are a slew of organizations around that people can go to. If it's housing, if it's questions around people feeling that they weren't shown the same properties, or as we have recently experienced in the subprime and foreclosure crisis here, that they felt they really qualified for a conventional loan, and they somehow felt they were being steered to a mortgage company that was only offering them a subprime loan. There are legal remedies now. There are in most states. The Attorney General actually might be interested in that. But there are also, in most states that I'm familiar with, there are housing advocacy organizations that can take those up. Nationally, there is an organization called the Center for Responsible Lending that is headquartered in Durham, North Carolina, that really is the repository of some of the better studies, and not just studies, but some of the better proposed legislation that is trying to combat the social injustice in the housing and the subprime area. So, I think my answer really is that there are people who, dedicate themselves to the needs of more vulnerable populations and trying to combat injustice where they think they see it, but they're in their own institutional areas, whether it be healthcare, whether it be housing, or the ACLU and other organizations around interactions with police is another area. So I know that those exist, and I've mentioned a couple of those organizations, but it really depends on the specific injustice that one is talking about. Does that help?
Yes. How does the system of white supremacy harm non-white people directly and indirectly?
In the work I've done, the most direct impacts really have to do on the economic side, and they really have to do with fewer opportunities to generate wealth, which in turn translate into fewer opportunities for moving one's family to a better life and social mobility. The indirect are a lot harder to measure. The indirect have to do, I think, with the way people think about themselves. It has to do with some psychology. It has to do with living in neighborhoods that might have more toxic dumps in them. Living in neighborhoods that has housing that might have more lead paint. It's not something that people buy into or even know about, but may well impact their health and their well-being for many years to come. So I think those are some of the more direct and indirect impacts.
Okay, that'll be all for now.
Thank you.
Groovy. Want to hop back in the book. I definitely want to get back to the the issue of inheritance that you talk about in your book, and how that has an incredible impact of passing along whatever inequalities existed in previous generations. I did want to ask, though, page 32, you were talking about this $9 trillion legacy that is being passed along from the baby boomer generation. And you said that this is a lot of money, but it is distributed very unevenly. Most whites do not inherit considerable wealth. An even smaller percentage of African Americans benefit. Hand in hand with this money, I submit, what is really being handed down from generation to generation is the profound legacy of, I want to see if it would be accurate to replace, to say, from generation to generation, what is being handed down is the profound legacy of racism, white supremacy. Would that be an accurate substitute, because you have racial inequality?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm not sure whether we want to. You may want to get into this more than I do. I have a, if you will, a theory of change. I have a very profound sense about how you craft a book like this, how you make an argument, how you want to get. I very much want people to get to the last chapter, and it's a very different sense of crafting and telling a story and making an argument than other people. Do I understand correctly that Tim Wise has been on this show?
The admitted white supremacist known as Tim Wise has been on this program.
AKA Tim. My guess is that he would write a very different book. So that, and I've had this conversation a lot of times, especially with my graduate students, who pick it up and sometimes get angry when I first sort of assign the first part of the book and then the second part. The first part of the book, the first 5 chapters or so, you won't find very many mentions of the word racism. But you will in the last 3 chapters. Because I very consciously have tried to build an understanding of how the dynamics of a system operates in a way that builds in rewards and incentives for people to act in ways that are racialized. And once I feel I've done that, then I can use me personally. Then I use the word racism. Then I use sort of the phrase structural racism. My sense is, if I were to open up that way, if the first page is the problem in America is white racism, white privilege, and the things that I may want to say 200 pages later, it's me personally, but I don't think the reader, many of the readers, especially the white readers, are going to go very far beyond that. That they're not really going to take the argument into consideration.
Very interesting.
So I've had conversations. The first time I actually taught out of the book to a graduate class. Some people who are now dear friends and colleagues, who were young graduate students then, the first word out of their mouth was, Professor Shapiro, how come the R word's not in the book? And the R word is racism for them. And I said, well, we talked about it a bit, and I said, after you finish the book next week, tell me if we're still having this conversation. And then we could have a good, open, honest conversation about how you, strategically and theory of change, how you craft an argument to take an audience from one place to another.
Very interesting.
So the answer to your question is yes, I could make that substitution. If I had to do it again, would I go back and do it? Probably no. I would make that substitution in the latter part of the book.
Okay. I have likewise had to be very strategic about when I use the term white supremacy in talking about racism. However, I do think that non-white people, we tend to be very confused about racism, much more so than white people, I have found. I think this program is evidence of that. And I think
we all are.
No. I strongly disagree with that. Non-white people are way more confused about this than white people. Non-white people are significantly more confused about this than white people. The white people that I've had on this program have had, even when they've said, "Oh, wait a minute, I don't think all white people are racist," even when they quibble about that, the vast majority of white people have said, "Yes, you're the second white person that's been on this show today, and you said, yeah, seems like what you're saying is mostly accurate. I have a couple quibbles, but yeah, that seems pretty accurate." Yeah. About half of the non-white guests that have been on this show have said flat, "No, I don't think such a system exists, and or I don't think your definition is accurate." I see it every day. There's an incredible amount of confusion amongst non-white people about this, which in my view is a core part of our victimization as non-white people. We do not understand what is happening around us. We do not understand racism. And so because of that, I try to make every effort to use the most accurate terms because I think that helps provide clarity. But I wholeheartedly understand your reason for saying racial inequality as opposed to racism at that point in the book, wholeheartedly.
At least at that point. No, I think we agree on that. Maybe it's I think white people generally have a much tougher time around the denial and privilege part.
Oh, I agree with that. I do not think, however, that means that they are ignorant about racism or don't understand it. I just think that they do not wish to speak about their culpability in the practice of racism, white supremacy, honestly. I think that's what's happening there. I think non-white people are just confused and victimized by what's happening, so we're confused.
Mm-hmm. Can I tell you a story?
Oh, yeah, let's hear it.
Let me tell you one of the stories in the book. There's a family in a suburb in St. Louis. So a suburb that's not very far out of the city. And St. Louis has got culturally probably the harshest racial barriers of any of the cities that I looked at in this book, certainly in comparison to Boston and L.A. and other cities I've been to. It's just because things have been harsher there. At any rate, this was a family living in, it was basically an all-white suburb. And we were talking to them about the story of how they came to buy their house. Tell us that story, and they sort of regaled us a bit, and it was a very interesting story. They talked about having their young kids and not feeling safe in their community and not liking the quality of the schools and the choices that were available to them. And so they started working 2 jobs each, and they started holding garage sales. And this went on for a couple of years. And they talked about working themselves to the bone and overtime, and I'm sure it was very genuine. And then the mother said, we were having dinner with my mother one night, and she was asking how it was going, and we were talking about the garage sales and the working of 2 jobs and all this, and she said, "You know what?" My mother said, "This is ridiculous." Opened up her pocketbook, took out a check, and wrote a check for $30,000. All right, now they tell us this story. The interview goes on, and at a latter point in the interview, we're kind of going through a checklist around assets, and we ask, again, we're re-asking, how did you acquire this, and how did you acquire that? And the tone gets very defensive at that point. And when we asked them about their home, the answer was, we deserved it. We worked hard. And the interviewer reminds them about the $30,000 check. And there's a waving of the hand, and there's this real insistence, and they use the word we deserved it. We worked hard. We worked 2 jobs. We had garage sales. We earned it. They were wrapping that moment of privilege in the American dream. They were wrapping the use of the term earned and deserved was very revealing. And of course, what you don't want to say, but you don't want to be snide about it. But the point is that a lot of people work 2 jobs. Millions of people work 2 jobs. A lot of people hold garage sales. A lot of people deserve that better home and that better school, but they don't have that opportunity.
I haven't really looked at the chat room to see. I suspect this could be a constructive program. Generally, when my guests are going right down my list in the exact order that I have things lined up, I generally think the program is going well. I actually had highlighted that exact story. If you get the book, it's page 72 and 73. I responded the same way when he read it. When I was reading the book, I didn't know whether to put the book down and laugh or cry, or I've never had anyone say, hey, you're struggling? Here's a check for $40,000. This is silly. No need for a garage sale. Even though you highlight in the book, a lot of white people don't have that access. A lot of white people do, and especially a lot more white people than non-white people in this area of the world.
That's for sure.
To wrap cherry on top of this story, it continues where I guess they were trying to go and do the closing and everything for the house, and there was an additional $10,000 fee.
Right.
How did we do it?
Right.
I'm quoting, Mom, we need more than we thought, and my mom and dad gave it to us. Cherry on top of this story. As I said, you're walking right down my notes here. You talk a lot in your book. I felt that was a big theme where the white people that you were interviewing talked about, hey, we worked hard. We worked. We have our jobs and everything. We earned it. We deserve it. And you, as you just said, there seemed to be a real contradiction when it would be, well, wait a minute, didn't your parents help out with some of the housing costs, or did your parents pitch in with private school that you're doing for your kids, or did you get any sort of gifts or anything? Did you get a loan, wink wink, that you didn't have to pay back? And really, we got some help. We did work hard, but we also got some help. And I think, at least for me as a non-white person, it really helped illuminate white people are conditioned to think we deserve to have a great life. We deserve a high-quality life. And I don't think white people are conditioned to feel like everyone should have access to a quality life, particularly non-white people. It's, hey, they're not supposed to have a quality life, and it's their fault that they don't have it. Do you think there's some accuracy there?
Oh, absolutely. I think if you take that one half step further, and my guess is it's more than a guess. My highly educated guess is that it's precisely those white families, many of whom are then going to turn around and are going to, quote, blame the individual lack of hard working and other characteristics of people who don't have it, when in fact their overblown sense of entitlement has pulled the blinders down on their own lack of ability to understand where they're fitting into this story. Yeah. Let me tell you. See if you have this one highlighted too.
Let's see.
As a researcher, you let people speak their own voice, but that doesn't mean that you accept that voice uncritically. Some researchers think you give people their voice, and there's no role there's no critical insight for the researcher there. I don't think that at all. There was one family also in St. Louis who, in the course of the interview, talked about to use code words and code phrases at first about the neighborhood going down, the house prices going down, the safety with the community was going down, the schools were going down, and the interviewer pressed them, and of course it turned out to be that they were moving from the north side of St. Louis, and the only theys in the north side of St. Louis are African Americans. And this was a community where, subsequent to after that interview, I remember I listened. It's not an interview I personally did. It's one I listened to, and I read the transcript, and it just didn't ring right. And what didn't ring right was the migration, if you will, of African Americans from North St. Louis into their particular community. So I started to do pretty systematic drive-throughs in that community. I would get in my car, and I would crisscross, a 12-block radius of where that family lived, looking for black folks. and I'm not seeing it. They're not there. And I say, all right, well, is this 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning and everybody's working and I'm missing it? No. So, I do the systematic, drive through at another time of day, and, I'm still not seeing it. I go to the census data. It's not there. The census data could be a few years old. So the last thing I did was I went by that community again on a Saturday morning because there was a big park that had literally like 9 baseball diamonds and soccer fields. I'm saying to myself, now, if there are black families in the neighborhood, certainly they're children, and I'm going to see children of color on this playground. None. Zero. Nada. What was going on was, and this was a classic case, I think, of this family had talked themselves into that the highest value they would have on their home was at the point right before that community became integrated. And they consciously moved on that, fearful, paranoid, or whatever, that some migration was actually happening when in fact it wasn't, from everything that we could tell, from observations, the census data, down to the block level, from going to open houses and talking to realtors on the same block, for example. But that family's action of fleeing probably was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Their act of fleeing and getting out, quote, before they could move in, probably hastened that particular migration.
Wow. I remember that incident vividly, and I remember you checking the census data, and I believe the census data revealed it was 97% white.
Yep.
Yeah.
They're blocks, the immediate blocks.
Yeah, to me, that really
translates into one family, by the way.
I mean, that tells me a lot about how white people are trained and conditioned to feel about non-white people and black people specifically. You talked about this later on in the book as well, as it related to schools, that white people would talk about diversity. Oh yeah, diversity's good perspective, but when they mean diversity, very different thing than when non-white people use the term diversity. For white people, it's about 10% is the cap. Anything over that, and it's, well, wait a minute, the neighborhood's gone to trash. Time for us to leave. This is terrible. For non-white people, they're thinking, a lot closer to anything I would think around the 50% range. But for white people, I think you used the exact quote of 10%. Once it goes over 10%, this is not cool anymore.
That's right. When we talk to people, and this is confirmed in studies around housing and attitudes that Professor Larry Bobo and others have done. For the most part, there's a really high level of consensus among African American families and white families that they want to live in diverse, integrated neighborhoods, and they want their kids to go to integrated and diverse schools. But they mean something very different by diversity and integration. and this was true even for some of the families in St. Louis that that sort of had the most racialized language. And again, St. Louis, I don't know whether it was our sample in that city or what, or people didn't know what was polite and not polite to talk about. They could actually do it. But in St. Louis, they were talking about it much more often. Most black families would talk about wanting their kid to go to an integrated school. And when you broke it down and talked to them further about that, there was one or two children of color, maybe.
Wow. Again, Thomas Shapiro, author of The Hidden Cost of Being African American, and all this stuff is in the book. This isn't just stuff we're making up. If you get the book and read it, you'll see these stories. I wanted to throw, because he has lots of great stats throughout the book. I wanted to just toss this one out to people listening before we move forward. On page 55, Dr. Shapiro, he was talking about black businesses, and you still see this wealth gap between white people and black people. And he says on page 55 that for black businesses, each new dollar that they get generates $1.98, whereas for white people, each new dollar that a white business gets generates $3.25. So for all the people I've heard, non-white people, black people, saying that the key is generate more businesses, that is not really going to get rid of the racial wealth gap that the system of white supremacy creates and maintains. I wanted to... Actually, I'm going to go to Justice. I think she said she's ready for questions. Justice, do you have some questions for Mr. Shapiro?
I heard that you didn't really explain the definition of social justice to me too well. Can you clarify social justice for me, please?
Oh, I'm not sure I can do a whole lot better. I'll try because it is important. For me, social justice has really two parts to it. It has a part about process or rules being the same for everybody, the sort of the equity and the same kinds of opportunities for people. But it also has a second part, and the second part is about the rewards or the results, the distribution of resources that occur. It's not just about playing by fair and equitable rules. It's that the distribution of whether it be education or good homes or home ownership or health or well-being or wealth in a society also has a just distribution in terms of what people need to make them develop as human beings.
How do white people keep information from non-white people?
That's another great question, Justice. I think for the most part that there is on a personal level, there's a denial of really telling a story that's authentic about how they and their families make it in American society, how they do as well as they do. And so I think that they withhold information that way. They withhold really telling the story about how their own story about how they make it. But at a larger societal level, there's also a huge problem of, in my estimation, of how history is written, of the history that's deemed relevant in school curriculum, the history books that we have, those events of history that are deemed to be important or relevant. I think that in any society, there's an old phrase that says the victors get to write history, and the losers or the victims are usually written out of history. And I think that that's certainly true of the United States as well. For the most part, our history, the official history that we hear, is the history mostly of dominant groups. So, for example, if we were to tell the history of, which we don't often, it's maybe, if it's in a history book, it's a paragraph in the schools that we read about, of the Homestead Acts in the middle part of the 1800s, right before and then right after the Civil War. The Homestead Act was both at the national level and then states did it. It was essentially a bargain that said if a family could demonstrate it could build a dwelling that it actually lived on a piece of land, and if they could demonstrate that they could earn a living off of that land, whether it was mining or farming or whatever it was, then the state or the federal government would give them that land. They wouldn't have to pay for it. They would have to put in sweat equity. They would have to demonstrate that they could actually settle, live, and earn a living there. Now, that sounds like a great universal history, and is sort of part of a frontier thesis around American history, around keeping people moving continually westward for opportunities. And to a certain extent, there is certainly a lot of truth in that. But the part of the history that's not told very often is that about 1 in 4 homeowners or property owners today in America, their family can trace their original property ownership to those Homestead Acts. That's one truth that's not told. That's sort of not part of the history. That's a very large number. The second aspect that's not told very much at all is that the Homestead Acts, well, first of all, for the most part, it was land stolen from Native Americans, and that people of color they were eligible for, but the way it was administered, in very few places did African American families receive any land of any real value. So the telling of that history, the telling of that story, is a part, I think, of a central denial about how families make it in America, and the opportunities for property ownership and wealth generation were open to some groups, but denied to others.
What ways do you know of how to get money?
What ways do I know how to get money? You know, for most Americans and for most American families, money comes from the job they have and the work they do, and it really starts from there. Somebody once said that the best housing program was a good job. The best home ownership program was a good job. And, you know, I don't agree with that person usually, but, you know, that statement's probably generally true. Not much is given in this society to people without their returning something of value in terms of their labor or their business or their experience in some way. Then from that income that people make off of their work, there are a lot of things that we can do with it. There are a lot of ways that wealth can be generated from that. As I talked a lot about earlier in this conversation, the best way that Americans have generated wealth, money like that, is by buying a home. Now that may no longer be true to the extent it used to be because of the depression in the housing market and the foreclosure crisis, but for a long period of time, and it's certainly still true if anybody bought a home more than a few years ago, they have had the opportunity of creating some wealth for themselves because the value of that home has gone up over time. Otherwise, the economists will tell you if you earn $1, you should put 10 or 15 cents into a bank account, into a savings account, and when that grows to a few dollars, you might consider making some other investment in it so that you can earn higher interest. That's what the classic way of generating wealth tells us.
Okay, that'll be all for now.
Thank you.
Groovy. Again, Professor Thomas Shapiro, author of The Hidden Cost of Being African American. So really, I guess, hammer at the heart of your book and this particular subject matter. You share a lot of information about how home ownership and how, if you are a non-white person, you really feel, whether you are aware of it or not, you really experience racism, white supremacy in home ownership, making an effort to acquire a home, appreciation of the value of your home, interest rates, mortgage, just the whole kit and caboodle. You will really, racism, white supremacy will really be brought to bear if you are, in your book, you're focused on black people in making an effort to get a home. I wanted to share just some of how that works out and how black people experience this through home ownership. Could you talk about, I guess, pick one to start with. Yeah, let's do appreciation value. Make sure we got that clear, because I think that's very important. How racism, white supremacy is manifested in the appreciation or depreciation of homes for black people.
Sure. First of all, housing appreciation is pretty simple. It's the amount of value that your home goes up over the period of time that you own it. So that if you buy a home on Long Island, New York, for example, 10 years ago, and that home cost you $400,000, today that home, I'm just being hypothetical here, that home might you might be able to sell that home for $450,000. That means that the family that bought that home 10 years ago, there's now $150,000 in paper wealth that home has created for them because it has appreciated over time. And we're assuming they keep the house up and they make their payments on their house, etc. But that's the prime way that most American families actually generate wealth, is through their appreciation of their housing value over time. So obviously, and the dynamic is an obvious one here, obviously the longer you have owned your home, the more wealth likely has been built up into it. Especially if you bought a home before 2005, for example. The housing market dynamics, because of subprime, get pretty murky from 2005 and until the current time. A different set of dynamics are temporarily operating. So how does that create housing wealth differently in white and non-white communities? I would go back to the conversation that the earlier part of the conversation, where generally it's the case that schools are considered to be higher quality if they're in a high-income white community. And that in turn drives the housing price up more, because the only way you can get your kid to a high-quality school in that community typically is to buy a home there. So that in turn ups or boosts the pricing dynamic on the house and creates, if you will, more of that paper wealth for everybody else who already has bought a house in that community. That same kind of dynamic doesn't operate nearly as much in non-white communities, so that the housing appreciation value doesn't go up nearly as much. Let's take another example, and I think this is one that I like to talk about because it stretches back and reminds us of a really important part of our history, that is very much a part of our present and our future as well. If we were to think about Levittown, New York, Levittown, New York was one of the, not the first, but it's often considered to be a classic or the classic American suburb, where homes were built, tract homes were built. They weren't very large. Right after World War II, for returning veterans, for the housing demand that had built up because the country had been in a depression for many years. We came out of the depression after World War II. A lot of young adults were coming home, starting families or rejoining families. There was a big housing demand, especially in the Northeast, around communities where people could commute to New York City for work, and maybe even to Philadelphia if they were willing to commute a further distance. Levittown, New York, one could buy a home in 1950 for about $25,000. Today, if that same home was kept up over time and wasn't allowed to deteriorate and things were fixed, that home, the last time I checked, sold for about $350,000.
Wow.
Now that's a long period of time, 1950 to 2005 or so. I think was the last time I really checked that piece of data around Levittown. That's a lot of wealth. And it wasn't created because somebody was shrewd or they deferred spending or consumption or anything like that. No, it's much part of a larger institutional dynamic around wealth creation and home ownership. Now, of course, another part of the Levittown story is that African Americans, among several groups, were named as people who were not eligible to buy homes in Levittown, New York, by the developer Arthur Levitt. And it was written into the title of the homes he sold that people in turn couldn't even sell their homes to a list of people that included African Americans. So that incredible opportunity to buy a home in Levittown, New York in the 1950s and created all that wealth for that family as they aged, or their children, or maybe even their grandchildren now, provided them their down payment money, the startup money to start a business, the money that paid for their children and grandchildren and maybe even great-grandchildren's college education. That was denied to African Americans. So again, for me, the if you will, the sociology of wealth is understanding the opportunities available in different eras and generations for the ability or the lack of ability to own property, to own homes, to own businesses, to create wealth. And Levittown and the hundreds of Levittowns like it across the country, is a classic example of racism, if you will, by law or by custom that ripples and reverberates to this present day and will continue to ripple and reverberate for generations to come.
Wow. We had a couple folks that called in. Before I go see if we can get a call or two,
Sure.
I did want to ask you, you said in your book, and I believe you already said it on the show once, racism is rewarded, and you talked about the example of the white gentleman who was concerned that too many non-white people were moving into the neighborhood, so he was going to bail out before his property value was adversely impacted. I guess I wanted to ask about that, and if you could share other ways that you feel racism is rewarded.
Sure.
And also, if you think it would be accurate to say that white flight, the white people who choose to leave an area because non-white people are moving in, if that is a conscious and or unconscious act of racism.
That's going to be tough. Let me surround that a little bit and then drive right at it. The main institutional dynamic I'm dealing with in the book is around property and homes and schools. So, but it's sometimes really hard and complicated and difficult to attribute motivations to people saying they want to move to a different community, and you're asking them why and what was wrong with the old one and what do they like about the community they were trying to move to, and the same thing about the schools. So as researchers, we're faced in that's a huge problematic for us. I'll tell you a research story. I was lucky enough to have some really bright PhD level graduate students that worked with me on the project, especially around the interviews, doing the interviews, coding them, transcribing them. We would read them together and make memos on them. We'd pass notes. Well, every now and then, maybe once every other week or so, a breathless young 22, 3, or 4-year-old, very bright graduate student would come running into my office and say, "Tom, you are not going to believe this interview. You are not going to believe how racist this family is." And we'd sit down, and I would want their story. And tell me, what are you hearing? What did you read in there that made you, made you run down the hallway before I would look at it myself? And usually it was a story about a family moving from an integrated community to a non-integrated one, or moving their kid into a school system where it would be almost all white. And I would always come back, and sometimes the language had some racialized tones to it. Sometimes it didn't. It was hard to tell. And I would push back, intellectually at least, I would push back with the graduate student. And the question I would ask them always was the same. My question was, in fact, is the school they got their kid to better? It's the reward question. And the answer always was yes. And that's what I was trying to drive home, and I was trying to build a way of, how do you tell that kind of story in a book? The story being that people acting on some of the most important decisions in their lives, they may be acting on racialized or non-racialized motives. It's really hard to tell sometimes. But at the end of the day, they in fact are rewarded for what they do. In fact, their kids get to a higher quality school. In fact, for the most part, they got to that quote-unquote better neighborhood if you measured that by services rendered and the income level of the neighbors and those kinds of indicators that may not be the best ones. So they're rewarded for making that choice. The system rewards them for doing that. So if you were to ask the question, wouldn't they be irrational to do otherwise? Or what would be the system of logic that would make them not make those moves, so that when they do make those moves, they're being rewarded, they're being incentivized, if I can use that as a word, to do so. That result for them, their community, and the society is that they have acted in a racialized way. And when that pattern, when millions of people act like that, you get a system of structural racism, which may not consciously be acting out of a racist motive. They're being rewarded to do so, and that's the racism. People being rewarded for acting in a way that has a racialized result. I hope that didn't sound like mumbo-jumbo.
No, not at all. I do want to point out that I did ask the question saying conscious and or unconscious, but not mumbo-jumbo. Don't think the question was answered completely, but not mumbo-jumbo. I do want to underscore that. It sounds like, if I'm accurately summarizing what you just said, that in a system of racism, white supremacy, white people are compensated to behave consciously and or unconsciously in a racist manner. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct.
Okay.
That's absolutely correct. The flip side of that, in some way, was in this research project, the graduate students were saying, well, they were always trying to find the hero interview. And you know what the hero interview was for them?
What's the hero?
They were, well, two of the graduate students were Hispanic, the others were white. The hero interview for them was the white family choosing integration over over the move to the suburbs.
Wow. How does that represent I'm going to put that in quotes for sure. How does that represent the hero interview?
Oh, well, they wanted to find the white families, a white family acting against their self-interest, because they believed because they didn't want to act like other white people, because they were aware of the dynamics. That's what I meant.
I gotcha.
They did find one. We did find one.
I think you even shared one story in your book of a white family that was in an area that had more than 10% non-white people, and it was an economic boon for them because they got a pretty good piece of property, and the value was great. It was appreciating, and they had a pretty nice income, so it was win-win-win all the way around for them, and I suspect they were still benefiting from being white in a system of white supremacy.
Yeah, until, as we were talking about, until the tipping point is reached.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah. The phone line just exploded all of a sudden. I guess I'll hush and see if we can get some questions in. There are a lot of 111, so you'll just have to say something to see if it's you. If you called it 111 and put a hand up, say something.
Something.
There we go. Gotcha.
Professor Shapiro, you were just talking about the reward of better schools that white families get when they move out of a neighborhood that is that has more black people in it than the one that they moved to. And I was just wondering what constitutes a better school. And I'll qualify my question so that you'll kind of get a sense of why I'm asking. I was formerly a high school teacher and even currently live in a neighborhood that is predominantly black. And there are white students who come into this neighborhood, into the magnet schools. They invariably end up in the advanced placement classes. They invariably end up testing very well as the kids at the posh schools that are located in the almost all-white high schools. And so I'm wondering if the white students in this neighborhood do as well as the white students in neighborhoods that are almost all white. Why is the latter considered a better school?
I'd have to. I think it's a great question. I'd have to know more about the particulars and the dynamics. But part of the strategy of some magnet schools is quite intentionally to create a higher quality educational environment. Sometimes around a theme, sometimes not. Whether it's science or performing arts or whatever it might be. And those kind of schools have a lot of attraction. And part of the attraction, I think, is that it is more specialized. It, in theory, has picked or has found its way to get better teachers. They seem to hit better on the elements that make up higher quality education, like student-teacher ratios, like decision making for teachers in school affairs and curricula and computers and books in the library and playgrounds and stuff like that. When I was doing the study in St. Louis, Missouri was one of the cities we were working in. They had a real interesting dynamic, and there's this. I may not I'll probably goof the name of the book. I think the book is called Crossing the Race Line or something like that. Maybe Gus can look it up. It's in the bibliography of The Hidden Cost of Being African American, where the study was essentially asking the question, did African American students do better in magnet schools in the city of St. Louis, the kind of schools I think you're talking about, or did they do better academically if they were part of a voluntary busing program and were accepted in some of the more middle class or upper middle class communities in the county of St. Louis. And the answer the researchers came to by looking, they were judging college prep courses that were taken, student grade point averages, and ultimately whether they applied for college and were admitted to college. The answer was the white schools in the suburbs, that the African American kids who went there and lasted long enough to graduate fared better. And the researchers answered about why that was the case was that it's part of the culture of those upper middle class schools that everybody's going to college. And so going to see a guidance counselor and prepping for the tests and all that stuff was not something out of the ordinary. It was just part of what's done in a school like that. Whereas in the magnet schools, it often is something new that people don't have a whole lot of experience with.
The phone line continues to explode. The other 111.
Oh my gosh, what have I said?
I hope it's been constructive. We'll find out. Other 111, say something.
Is that me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah, I'm really interested. I've come on your show several times here and always find it interesting. I'm a teacher, and when I grew up in I would say, mixed culture community, it was, I hung out with, my father was an electrician. I hung out with other kids that, for the most part, were of the blue-collar class of sorts. Went to one of the best or better schools on the richer end of town. Remember clearly never being welcome there, and I went there to grade 11, and then I decided to go to a vocational school, and I was going to become a mechanic. And the strange thing that happened was I ended up going to this church camp in the summertime, and to make a long story short, I met this group, and they got to know me. They would give you a bursary to go to a private school. Now, had I not gone to that private school, I wouldn't be a teacher today. I'm convinced of that fact. I had to work for a whole summer and save half, and my parents paid the other half. But that level of standard somehow just sunk in and with me, and I went, oh my goodness gracious me, I really, really have to pull my weight here. And then of course I went off in the other direction, university. But one of the interesting points I want to make here is that in my experience, regardless of the amount of education you have, I have 2 university degrees. I'm an honors student. I live in a predominantly Mennonite area. Parents were sick for years and basically took care of them. But the interesting thing here is that even though, this predominantly Mennonite area, they're supposed to be these compassionate people, it's a very supremacist attitude. Out of the whole 17 years I've lived here, I've only got one job interview in the area. It's like this everywhere down here. And I'm convinced that you are, regardless of your education and qualifications, it's obviously, everybody knows this, it's who you know, but it's also what culture you belong to. And I find that really sad, that it's based on someone's religion, or it's based on someone's belief, or do you find those kinds of things occurring?
Yes, maybe not as sort of as rigidly as it sounds like the community that you're referring to is. But yes, most people learn about jobs not from the want ads in the newspapers, for example, but from friends, coworkers, relatives who bring an opportunity to their attention. And that means you have to have that kind of network, and before you'll even know about those kinds of opportunities. I think it's something we probably could study and understand a lot better, but we also intuitively know, just from people around us, that culture, whether it's around religion or whether it's around ethnicity or around race, matters a lot. People kind of cue through their language and other ways their membership in different cultures, and we sort of define that as kind of soft job criteria in some ways. Yes, they'll fit in better. The skill sets may be the same, but are they going to be a team player? What does that mean? That means, can we talk? Do we have the same values? And so those kinds of networks, I think, are very important.
916. Did you have a question for Professor Shapiro? 916. Are you there? Okay, assume he's just listening. Thank you for listening, 916. 248. Are you there, 248?
Yes, I don't have a question. I'm just listening.
Oh, thank you for listening. I appreciate it. 720. Are you there?
Hotel Victims.
Greetings, sir. Second time. Thank you for calling back.
My pleasure. I have a question for Dr. Shapiro. I find when talking with other non-white people, and this is a little bit off the subject, but this is something I'm really concerned with. And as a white person, I'd like to get your thoughts on it. I find that when I'm speaking with non-white people, one of the things that keeps us divided consistently is when we speak about being suspicious of all white people. Inevitably, the non-white people I speak with bring up the fact that, well, it's not all white people, and besides, you have to look at their intentions or whether or not they're conscious or unconscious. These three things, conscious, unconscious, and intention, seems to be a major dividing line amongst non-white people and their loyalty to our so-called friend and ally, non-intentional or unintentional white people. How do you feel, or what are your thoughts on how conscious, unconscious, or intentional or unintentional divides non-white people and eliminating white supremacy?
Mm-hmm. I think it's a great question because it's such a huge issue, and for me it really goes to again the question of how aware people are of their own situation, of how their ability to understand their own story, how they've arrived at where they are, the way they did, and what they're going to do about it, such that I think when I talk, and I'm blessed in many ways that I have a lot of opportunities to talk before groups across the country and beyond, and in radio shows, television, lectures, all over the place. And I know that when I talk in those situations, that often your responsibility, your obligation, your commitment is to, because you're believing something and you're passionate about my views on social justice and race and racial justice in the United States, that I feel I have to be really intentional and really conscious, and maybe be a little sometimes make the point a little tougher than I might make it before friends, because I want to. Sometimes you want to challenge. You want to challenge the comfort zone where an audience might be at a particular time. And that's something, because I'm interested in these ideas and these topics. It's not the normal conversation that happens in most, in the homes in most of America, or in the churches of most of America, or the coffee shops, or the restaurants, or the schools, where we tend to be, if you will, I suppose the easy way to say it is more polite, less intentional, less conscious, and that then makes it very difficult to understand where people are coming from, what their motives are, so that you're always kind of wondering what do they really mean, or as people sometimes say to me, Tom, do you know what their real agenda is? And that what does that betray? That betrays that whatever group you were just in, somebody you couldn't really understand where somebody was coming from and what they're meaning by something. So and I think finally in a society where race and inequality are such critical issues, that there's really very little support system for people to be brutally honest with themselves, and to talk to other people about those kinds of issues. We want to be friends. We want to be social. We want to be more polite. So that if that's the basis of the question you were asking about suspicion, I think there are ample grounds for suspicion in that way.
Everybody hang tight. Justice, she said she had some questions. Justice, go right ahead.
Why is white supremacy here?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
Why is white supremacy here?
Oh, why is white supremacy here? Ooh. Well, I think like a lot of the main parts of this program and this series around white supremacy helps us to understand the origins of white supremacy as a system of domination over the way people, over resources, over a group feeling that it maybe psychologically needs to feel superior about the way it's acting and behaving and its policies. I think that was the origination. Domination and white supremacy was around the colonial and imperial efforts in Africa and the Caribbean and other places. Originated by some of the most imperial and colonist nations, hundreds of years ago, and that system. That motivation, that system, still has remnants of it that operate in the thinking of nations and communities. So the bottom line, it's about power.
True. How do you think your book is constructive in working against racism and white supremacy?
How do I think it's constructive? I'm hoping that it creates space for people to have a conversation exactly like the ones we've been having for the last 2 hours, where nobody's yelling at each other, but really, well, you'll have to tell me about that later. You'll email me what's going on. Just don't give them my home address, right?
Too late.
Oh, that's why they're horns honking. No. One writes I write a book like this, not believe me, not because there's money or a whole lot of money to be made out of it. But because I'm really passionate around issues of racial inequality and social justice, and I I don't have enough hubris, so I actually think I have something to say to people. And I think my research is pretty good, and I think I've you can tell a story in a way that that makes people think a bit about their own lives and about where the nation is heading. So, I write a book like this to push this conversation further ahead on the national agenda. But the work, I hope, also has a political and a policy life to it. That is, people can look at particular areas. For example, I've been talking a bit about people being rewarded for making a certain move in terms of higher education. Well, there's a policy perspective, or there's a remedy to that, or at least there's a philosophy about a remedy to that, and the remedy is let's remove the reward for people moving to a higher educational environment. Let's make education so high quality every place that it's in nobody's self-interest to keep seeking a better educational environment for their kids.
How do you function around non-white people everywhere you go?
Well, I try and be open and honest. It's another great question, because I'm in a really unusual situation in that I am white, and I have written a book that people, especially non-white people, like to hear about. White people do too, but I often find myself in audience. I've spoken at historically black colleges, several of them in the past couple of years, and so I think there's a unique role that I'm playing as an expert, as a scholar, but also as somebody who is, if you will, giving witness to the fact that there are a lot of allies who are white and who are non-white that work together on issues like this. I think that was one of the huge messages, and maybe some of the reason for how well received the book Black Wealth, White Wealth has been, because one of the authors is African American and the other author, myself, is white. And it cheers people's hearts when they see that together sometimes still.
Okay, that'll be all for now.
Thank you.
I wanted to check that. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, I need to wrap up fairly soon here.
Oh, okay. No problem. Do you have time for one more question?
Sure.
Okay. Cree, did you have another question?
I did. I wanted to, thank you. I wanted to see if I could follow up on that question about what constitutes a good school. I think you did a really clear job in answering why it would be a better school. The suburban school that is mostly white would be a better school for a black child. But I'm not sure I understand why it's still a better school for white students, because in my experience, unfortunately and shockingly to me, I have taught in schools that were, say, 90%, maybe over 90% black people, and maybe 10% white. And invariably, those white students performed so much better than the black students and scored so much better on all the tests. And I had the opportunity also to tutor in the evenings at a private tutoring company in which students would be coming in. White students would come in who went to predominantly white schools, and I didn't find that they were doing any better than the white students that were coming to the school that I taught that was 90% black. So if the achievement is the same, because I guess I've come to the conclusion, I want to see if you agree, I've come to the conclusion that up to a certain point, how much a child knows is not mostly coming from what they're taught at school. It's usually coming from the things they're exposed to outside of school, including the home. So what is it that's making those white parents want to move their children to a school where they're around mostly white kids? Is it something besides what they're learning in the school? Is it access to power? Is it the ability to learn how to be a racist without having to hide because there's so many non-white people around? Why is it so important for them to go someplace where there's mostly white students when, in fact, their achievement really doesn't make much difference as opposed to when they're at a school that's got mostly black kids as opposed to white kids.
Well, I think you're right, but I would point out that most of the white families we interviewed in the book would disagree, that they think at least the opportunity for achievement is much greater for their children having made the moves or contemplating the moves that they want to make. But you're absolutely right on point that we tend to formalize education and think that it's only something that happens 8 months a year between 9 and 3, when in fact it's something that goes on every hour of every day in every community and in every family, and we all learn throughout that process, and we learn different things, and it may be that kids are learning different things and different the so-called what people think of as the returns of education. What was the family going to get out of it holds different perceptions in different communities. And I think there is a bunch of research that points to that until children and families of color believe that the schools serve them and serve their needs as opposed to sort of ranking, that it's tough. Until that happens, it's hard to get all families behind a universal educational reform policy. And then, of course, there's the social psychological research, and this is a tough one to swallow, but there's a research that tells us that young African American students in particular take race on pretty hard when they think they're being given an intelligence test. And they palpably score lower than they do on the exact same test when they're told it's not an IQ test or it's not a college prep test. But there's that whole mindset around the intellectual inferiority of minority students that is taken on personally, way too personally at those moments. And that's some of the work of social psychologist Steele at Stanford and others talk about that.
Wow.
And that's a pretty heavy drama to put on a young adult, I think.
Yeah. Wow.
Groovy. Thank you. I enjoyed the book. Number one.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure. It's been a quick 2 hours. I hope people were I don't want to say provoked, but got to chew on some new things. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing on this show.
I hope it is of constructive value. We might have to, maybe this will be an audition for we can check out Black Wealth, White Wealth, and perhaps have you back to discuss that one to give us some more to chew on.
I'd be happy to talk about that, and you can look at my co-author as well.
Oh, that's right. Again, Brandeis University, Dr. Thomas Shapiro, thank you a ton for coming through to speak with us today, sharing some of your Sunday evening, and we will definitely be in touch down the road, sir.
Great. Thank you, and peace.
Thank you. We're going to take a quick commercial, come back. I forgot to give Justice an opportunity to share her email address at the end of the last program. We'll come back and see if anybody has anything to say before we wrap things up. I'm going to do the commercial because I've missed it several times. So commercial break, and we'll be right back.
Is racism hurting you? On issues of race, are you unable to speak, think, and act with clarity and confidence? Are you tired of laughing when nothing is funny, smiling when you are not happy, agreeing when you really disagree? At counterracism.com, you can learn specific strategies and techniques to counter the behaviors of the people who practice racism in all areas of activity, using words correctly, following counter-racist logic, even counter-racist science projects designed to reveal what racism is, how it works, and how to counter it. The open source code writing format allows you to pick and choose from a variety of counter-racist suggestions so you can produce the code that works for you. Stop by counterracism.com today and help replace racism with justice.
That's counter-racism.com.
The cows, Justice, and Gus T Renegade. Before I check with anyone, I forgot to give Justice a chance to share her email address last program. So, Justice, please, email address.
justice.asap@yahoo.com. Again, justice.asap@yahoo.com.
Thank you, ma'am. Did you have any comments on the program? Or I guess you did hear the earlier program and you did call in. So did you have any thoughts on any of the programs from today, Justice?
No, I can't think of any right now. But I did have a question, one more question to ask him.
Dang. What question did we miss out on?
How can System of White Supremacy be stopped? I would really like to hear some answers to that because I really want to eliminate white supremacy.
Me too. He said he would be interested to come back. Black Wealth, White Wealth. I had looked at that book before. It was when Frank Wu was on the program in August. He talked about that book in Frank Wu's book, and I thought about getting one or both of those authors on the show then. So maybe we can get him back, and you can ask him. I know in this book, The Hidden Cost of Being African American, he talks about getting savings accounts for children, like when you're 10 now, so like your mom and dad, they could have got you a savings account when you were born. They can still get one now, but getting a savings account like as soon as you're born so that it will accumulate interest so that you'll have money by the time that you are 25. You'll have, a nice amount of money that's just kind of sitting there for you so you can get a house or start a business or go to college or, I don't know, travel the world, whatever. You'll have some money sitting for you. That's one thing that they should try and, white people should try and make these type of accounts available. He had some other suggestions as well toward the end of the book. But, yeah, I wish we had a moment or two more to get to some of those. But, yeah, that would be excellent information to get from him for sure.
Yes.
Did you have other thoughts that you wanted to share?
Not right now.
Okay. There are 4 people on the line. Your mics are open. That's 720 Cree 248 and another 111. I don't know who the other 111 person is, but all of you are there. You can say hi. You can share any thoughts you have or anything. Before we do that, I did want to say Dr. Welsing, again, she was on Truthful Out yesterday. Make sure you check that out. It's in the archives. Look for Saturday, November 14th, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing. She was there. Check out the program. Should be. You can download it, listen to the whole 9. Truthful Out, Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, Saturday, November 14th. Please listen. Okay. Anybody that's on the line, if you had a question, comment, anything you wanted to share?
I was curious as to how justice compares the two guests that you had today. Just in terms of justice, how did you feel? Like, did you have a feeling that one guest was more constructive than another, or did you feel like they're about the same, or what?
I would say that maybe both of them were constructive, but this one I think, I don't know. I think both of them were constructive.
Okay. Well, I thought it was the quality of information that you got out of both guests today. was significantly better on average than what is normally the case for the white ones. I have some ideas as to why that is, but if they can keep coming on and giving this kind of information, that'll be absolutely fabulous. I'm sure this had to be a pretty tiring day for you two, but especially you, Gus. But yeah, I'm wondering why the sudden increase in quality of response. Do you have a theory on that, Gus? I'm
sorry?
I'm sorry, if you agree that it is better. I don't know.
I am probably not the best person to ask about the value, quality, or constructiveness of my programs because I don't listen to my programs generally. I think I've listened to less than 10 of all the shows that I've done. So, yeah, it would kind of just be based on whatever I remember about the program, and I have generally noted that I have a very different perspective on programs just based on what I felt hosting the show as opposed to going back and listening to the show. So I don't know. I would probably have to sit down to check out both of today's shows to see what I thought, and then go back and compare it to the shows that I've heard from before. I felt the guests today, it seemed like they had constructive things to say. I don't know, folks that were in the chat room, it seemed like they felt they enjoyed the information that was shared. I don't know. Dr. Kevorkian, he was on the show in May. I thought that was constructive. I don't know. I don't know. I wouldn't be the best person to ask about making a comparison.
Yeah. No, I mean, I obviously by the growth in listeners that your show is generally very, very constructive. You always learn something. I just mean that the guests seem to answer the questions. As I think the word is dancing. There wasn't as much dancing as I think we're used to. With some of the white guests, you didn't seem to have to do a lot of pinning them over in a corner. They seem to offer up information without you having to ask the questions. They seem to, they know what we want to know, and they came forth with that information a lot without you even having to ask certain specific questions. So, I don't know. Maybe it's getting harder for them to run. I'm not sure. But if that's the case, why are they coming on at all? So it's a bit of a puzzle for me.
I will say with the first guest, I'd heard him speak before. I'd never heard him say anything about racism. Like, he has a lot. If you Google Stephen, I'm going to mess the name up now. Been on too long. Brucheska, I think that's it, or whatever it is. If you Google his name, you'll see he has a lot of presentations that are online, lectures and things, hours long. Like you can, if you enjoyed him, he has a lot of stuff online. Go check it out. I never heard him say racism in any of the talks that I listened to. I was a tad surprised that he was pretty willing to just, be honest. Yes, racism exists, and had quite a bit of information on that. I was a tad surprised about that. I don't know, people listening, maybe they thought that was constructive, maybe not, but I felt he was pretty honest, pretty open, and that was a bit unexpected. I thought he was going to have to be a little more work speaking with him.
Well, I'm tired from just listening to them, so I can imagine how tired you are. So I'm done talking.
And thank you for calling in twice, and hanging out, supporting the program. I appreciate it for sure. Sorry, go ahead.
I should say this. So tomorrow I'm going to actually get in there and schedule a show. So if people will be on the lookout for my show, I would appreciate it. So, because I have to get around to promoting it and stuff. But for the people who are actually listening to the archive of this show, just be on the lookout for a show that's going to show up in the schedule tomorrow. It'll be with Tommy Hart. We're going to talk about whether or not the Bible is religion or law and how it relates to white supremacy. So,
can we get the guest name one more time, please?
Tommy Hart. And he's the usual guest on Truth Will Out. Right. So.
Outstanding. And that's, you said the show won't be tomorrow, but you're going to post it tomorrow.
That's correct. I'm going to
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Talking with him about what day is a good day for him, and so it'll be posted tomorrow.
Okay. Outstanding. We will make sure to counter racist, evolving engineer. We will make sure to look out for that. If you post it tomorrow, I can plug it on the show Tuesday. So if you post it tomorrow, I'll make sure to get some promotion in as soon as possible.
Very good.
What's the blog so they can check that as well? The blog address, please.
Oh, the blog address is, you'd think I'd know the blog address. It's Cree7.
Tim Wise would know.
It's Cree7.wordpress.com.
Again, please.
Cree7.wordpress.com.
Thank you, ma'am. We will make sure, because I saw a brand new blog post as well. Folks can go check out White Equals Not Black, brand new blog post at Counter Racist Evolving Engineer. Check out the blog spot as well. Anybody else? Did they have anything to say before we close out? I think there are 3 people on the line. 720. There's another 111. Anybody?
Yeah, Renegade, I've got a question. The same question I had for Dr. Shapiro. Do you find that when you're speaking with non-white people who are less informed than yourself about white supremacy, when you bring up being suspicious of all white people, do you encounter a conflict with other non-white people where they may say, well, you have to look at their intentions or whether they're conscious or unconscious, and how much do you find that they then defend the white people, or that turns them away from what you're saying about trying to eliminate white supremacy?
I think for if you're really a fan of the C.O.W.S, right? Anybody who heard the C.O.W.S when it initially started 2 years ago in 2007, Back of the Bus and Gus, I believe the last broadcast that we did in 2007, we said that we were done talking to non-white people, black people specifically. We were done going to talk to white people. That was what we said the last program that we did, because it just ended up in conflict. Black people were not receptive. They didn't like the term victim. They didn't like the idea of not having sex with white people. They did not like the term white supremacy. It was very difficult to have any sort of constructive conversation, and they just were not receptive. So really, my answer would be the program runs the way that it does. I had 2 white people on the show today. Other than the surprise visit with Mr. Fuller on Friday, white person on the show last week, I think I've said repeatedly, I would much rather have a white person on the show, even if it's going to be Tim Wise. I would much rather have Tim Wise here than to have a non-white person who is confused, who's upset at the term white supremacy, who's upset over the term victim. I'd just rather talk to white people, they just seem to be not receptive for a myriad of reasons, not just suggesting that, non-white people be suspicious of all white people. So I think I've been very clear and consistent in my view that I just have not found it, I have not found myself to be successful in talking to non-white people. So that's why I try to talk to white people on my show, and I don't really know very many other people who are very good at talking to non-white people about white supremacy. I've seen non-white people get very rowdy with Mr. Fuller. I've seen it happen with Dr. Welsing. If you find anybody that's good at talking to non-white people about racism, you should take lots of notes, follow that person around, see what they're doing. But I don't even really know very many non-white people who excel at talking to other white people about white supremacy. Do you? Anybody on the call? Do you all know anyone?
No.
Other than Tim Wise. Tim Wise is a gangster. I'd have to put his name down. But yeah, other than white people, no, I do not know any non-white people who tend to be pretty successful at being able to talk about white supremacy. Much less suggest that you should be suspicious of all white people. I don't. I haven't seen that at all.
No, I don't know. I mean, I think Dr. Welsing's pretty good, although last night was an exception. I think that was the first time I actually heard, apparently you've heard it otherwise, but that's the first time I've actually heard a black person get rowdy with Dr. Welsing.
I've heard that before.
Oh, okay.
I've heard that before. And I've heard people talk about her like she's a crackhead, basically. Non-white people, I mean, and Mr. Fuller. That's why I said I don't know. They might be better. I'll say that. I think they're definitely better than most of the other non-white people that I've seen. But even their success rate, I would say, is no Tim Wise.
Yeah, that's true. Okay.
Unfortunately. Yeah. Oh well, that's white supremacy, though. I don't know. 720. Did that answer your question?
Well, just so that I'm clear, so you're saying that specific issue, in terms of being suspicious of all white people, that part of the conflict more than less?
It didn't really matter at the time. I was not aggressive. The thing that I was pushing aggressively at the time in 2007 that I said I was done talking to black people was not having sex with white people. I was not aggressively pushing be suspicious of all white people. I wasn't even saying that. And I would even say it was a problem where non-white people were not receptive. Even before it got to addressing white people, it was a problem in just addressing things that black people were doing. I remember anybody who was a fan of the C.O.W.S. In October of 2007, we did a program with the Black Student Union at the University of Washington, and the program was about they had an annual bachelor's auction where mostly black males were auctioned to mostly white sorority females. And we asked, is this something we should be doing in the context of white supremacy? And the Negroes were furious. I mean, I wish I had the video. There's some audio. There was a meeting that was had after they were on the show. We had some of the elected officials of the Black Student Union on the program, and we had a meeting 2 weeks later, and the Negroes came out of the woodworks. I'd never seen so many people at a Black Student Union meeting, and many of them were they were livid that someone would even question whether we should be having the bachelor's auction, and even suggesting that there was something incorrect about this, and saying that there's any legacy to slavery and auctioning black males. I mean, they were furious. So I have seen where, at least for myself and other non-white people that I know, the issue of being suspicious of all white people, that didn't even get brought on the table. It was just trying to do anything in terms of seriously speaking about white supremacy was a big problem. Non-white people just have not shown that they are comfortable or interested in having that conversation. At least that's been my experience.
I don't know, James. I tell a joke. And every time I tell this joke, I forget that people are listening. So if I happen to tell the joke, at a park or something, then I'll look and I'll see that some black people, as I define them, is simply just being not white. I'm not going to say what their derivation is. I'll get their attention. Sometimes they're black people with straight hair. Some people they're black people with curly hair and kinky hair, whatever. But here's the joke, and it always gets their attention. And they laugh and they look at each other, and it might be a big table of people. And I'm sure you've heard it before, right? So it goes, what's a good indicator that a white person is lying? And then, person waits. And I say, their lips are moving. And it always gets major laughs from these people I never know, that I've never seen before, that I didn't expect to laugh. And I think that goes kind of, that's basically saying the same message, that you should be suspicious of all white people. So I think there's a recognition by black people that that's the case. So I don't know, why it takes the delivery in the form of a joke to get that recognition, but I don't know why they get hostile when it's presented in another way. I don't know.
Have you experienced the same thing, 720, where you tried to talk to non-white people about white supremacy and they've got hostile, or you said specifically suggesting being suspicious of white people and they got hostile or didn't want to hear what you had to say?
Well, and specifically being suspicious of all white people. Then immediately I'm told, oh, well, not all white people. You have to look at their intentions or whether they're conscious. And there are good white people, and on and on and on and on. And yes, they become extremely hostile. Yes, yeah.
I feel your frustration.
Yeah.
I feel your frustration.
Can I ask you a question, 720? Does it seem to matter the gender? Do males seem to get more angry than females, or is it the same, or vice versa?
As a matter of fact, that's a very good question. The females seem to get more hostile.
Huh. Okay. That's not what I would have expected.
No, and it's interesting. I don't know. I tend to believe that, and I hope this won't offend anyone. I don't mean it to be offensive. That just by nature, women are more nurturing, and that nurturing aspect seems to come out in terms of protecting white people or defending them.
What about defending and protecting and nurturing their own offspring? By encouraging, you know what I'm saying?
Sometimes, I dare say all of the time, it seems as though the white people are much more important.
Wow.
It is an amazing thing, but I guess I really I don't know what to say. I guess just like Dr. Welsing said, Renegade, what's happening?
White supremacy. White supremacy. That's always the answer. White supremacy.
Oh, last thing. I don't. Have you explained to the listeners your name? Because I feel so silly that I didn't even know, what your name was and why it was, But I was doing some research and I'm like, I can't believe I didn't know this. But have you explained to the listeners why you've named yourself Gus Renegade? I don't know about the T part, but the Gus Renegade part, have you explained that on any of your shows?
Not in depth. I know I brought it up originally when the C.O.W.S first started in 2007. I think the first time I mentioned it on the air since I've been on Blog Talk Radio is when Mr. Patterson and Mr. Gooding were here in September when they brought up Birth of a Nation. I think that was the first time I said something on the program about it. I know 720, he emailed me about why I picked that as a name, but I don't think I've went in detail about it with the listeners. And other than 720, no one has asked. I think I just said then, go watch Birth of a Nation. I'm inspired by anyone who can cause a suspected racist to self-terminate and kills another suspected racist. that's unheard of for non-white people in motion pictures that I've seen. So I was inspired. That was a lasting image to see a non-white person causing white people serious problems. So that was why I picked the name. And again, just go watch Birth of a Nation, and you'll see my namesake.
Okay. All right. Well, I feel like I'm like a groupie or something, so I think I'm going to hang up before you sign off, because otherwise my self-esteem is going to suffer major damage. So. Good night.
Thank you for supporting, for sure.
No, thank you for your show, and thank you, Justice. Good night.
Good night. Good night.
All right. You're welcome.
Yeah. Thank you. I will definitely let everybody know as soon as I find out when her next program is going to be. I will let you guys know on Tuesday, next show. Yes, the next program is Tuesday, November 17th at 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. Dr. Robert Williams. This will be a non-white person, and I suspect this will be constructive. His book is about how white people are conditioned to be racist and how they are conditioned to see non-white people as folks who should be mistreated, or people at minimum that they should not be concerned about if they are mistreated. Dr. Robert Williams, he'll be here Tuesday, November 17th. This was suggested by Mr. Nero. He also suggested Meju Louis for Color of Wealth. So I can't take any credit for this one other than I followed up on his recommendation, but I suspect Dr. Williams will be very constructive. He is informed about Dr. Welsing's work. He is informed about Mr. Neely Fuller Jr.'s work. So just from the way that he writes, I'm pretty certain he'll be a very informed, much less confused non-white person for Tuesday, 8 p.m. Eastern. Other than that, I did want to point out one thing. As I said, I generally don't listen to my programs, but I did ask a non-white person who listened live when Dr. Nancy Krieger was here, and he listened again down the road. And he said that when he listened to it again, he did find that there was constructive information. He did find that she did share valuable things, which was the impression that I had during the program. I know that quite a few folks felt that she didn't do a good job sharing the information, that she used a lot of words, and she could have made things a lot simpler. And I agree with wholeheartedly. I think she could have definitely made a much greater effort to make it easier to grasp what she was saying. However, Dr. Nancy Krieger is no Tim Wise. She is not the person that you want to nominate from your group to go speak publicly and reveal your findings. I think she is an incredible researcher. I don't think she is a silver-tongued speaker. That's one. I think that might be a program you might want to listen to a second time through, because I do think there's constructive information, and I think some non-white people missed it. As I said when I was speaking with Mr. Fuller on Friday, I wholeheartedly believe that non-white people do have some deficiencies in communication. I try as best I can to manage that by asking guests to speak at a lower vocabulary level and to make it clear so we can all grasp what's being said. But on the other side, I think non-white people, we kind of gotta get in the gym in terms of communication. Whether that means listening to a program more than once, just doing more to sharpen our skills with communication so that we can grasp what's being said a little easier. Because I asked someone about John Henryism, and they said, I have no idea what that is. And my head just dropped. Again, I would mostly blame Dr. Krieger for that, but I hadn't even heard that before the program. I heard it live like everyone else, and I understood what she was saying, and I felt that was very constructive. So that would be my one recommendation. Perhaps go back, listen to that program again, and see if you think there's any constructive value. May not be, but I think you'll find that there are some very good things that she shared while on the program. I already told you, check out Dr. Welsing's program on Truthful Out that aired last night. Definitely constructive information always when Dr. Welsing is present. Mr. Fuller, I guess someone did not see. Again, Mr. Fuller was on the Cows on Friday the 13th. That program, I made an error with the phone, so the first 20 minutes of the broadcast did not pick up. Just fast forward through that, and then you'll hear the rest of the show. It's, I think, an hour and 40 minutes after that initial 20 minutes that I messed up. But that was my error in trying to use three-way. Just fast forward through the first 20 minutes, and you'll be able to hear the rest of the program with Mr. Neely Fuller Jr. Guess if I had to say anything else, thank you to Skydrifter. He made a whole clip on YouTube. It's like 10 minutes long of different segments from the cows, and it's got music playing in the background. I put it on the main show page here at Blog Talk Radio. So thank you, Mr. Skydrifter. Please check him out at YouTube. And he's made like 3 or 4 different videos with clips from the cows. So thank you for promoting the program. I hope it's been of value, and thank you for investing your time and energy to make that video. Yeah, if you have been listening to the program, please, I had asked for clips before. All you have to do, if you've been listening to the show, any segments, anything that a guest has said, anyone, even if it was a caller, that they've shared on this program, if you can let me know what program it was and the specific time in the program that it happened, I'm going to try and make a compilation of just different sound bits that have went down on the cows. That would be helpful. There are a lot of shows to pick from this point, so if there's something that Tim Wise said that you think is important that non-white people should hear, just let me know the time in the show that it happens. Dr. Eddie Moore Jr., Mr. Fuller, Dr. Welsing, the slew of guests that have been here, Professor Vernelia Randall. Just let me know the program and the exact time in the program where it happens, and I'll try and include that when we get it together. Should have at least a good week. I tried to do it earlier, but things didn't happen, so at least a good week. You can just shoot me an email, untiljustice@gmail.com. Other than that, I think that will do it. I had an idea. I have an idea for a show. I would like to do a show on Thanksgiving Day. The show I would like to do, because a non-white person shared this with me last week. She said that her uncle, who's a non-white person, was mistreated on the job. This person said that a white person made a racist joke on the job, and the joke that they told was this: what falls faster from a tree, an apple or President Obama? I think they just said Obama. An apple or Obama? The answer: an apple, because it doesn't have a noose around it. This was the joke. Apparently, this is what I was told, that a white person told to another non-white person on the job. My idea from all this was I would like to do a show on Thanksgiving where non-white people have an opportunity just to be thankful for not being at work that day to further experience racism, white supremacy, and we could all call in and share our experiences of being on the job and being victimized by racist white supremacists. I thought that would be interesting, and we could also share suggestions. If you have some tips on how to deal with racism on the job, I think that would be real constructive. Should be more people who would be available to do that on Thanksgiving. Ostensibly, more of us would not be working that day. So if you think that would be cool, just let me, if you have suggestions for a time that you think would be good, let me know. I think I'm going to do it. It's just a matter of time, whether you think earlier in the day or later in the day on Thanksgiving, so-called Thanksgiving. Let me know. But I definitely want to do that. I think that would be cool. Yeah, I think that's going to do it. Wrapping it up. Second show today. I hope they were constructive. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to the programs. I hope has not been a waste of your time. Again, we'll be back on Tuesday, 8 p.m. Eastern, 7 p.m. Central, 5 p.m. Pacific. Non-white male, Dr. Robert Williams. Should be a very constructive program. His book is great. Hopefully you'll go out and get the book and listen to the program. Justice, can you give him the email address one more time before we close out?
justice.asap@yahoo.com.
Outstanding. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We will be back in 2 days. Justice and Gus T Renegade. I'm actually going to play Mr. Williams' commercial one more time since I have missed it so many times. Mr. 720, thank you for continually supporting the program. Hope it has not been a waste of your Sunday checking us out today. Do you have any? I'm sorry?
Yes, Renegade and Justice. Hi, Justice. Thank you very much. Thank you. Very constructive.
Thank you. Thank you. We appreciate the support, sir. Yeah, until Tuesday, we will be back. I'm going to play Mr. Williams' commercial since I have botched it so many times. Thank you all for listening, and yeah, hopefully we will be on the road replacing white supremacy with justice immediately.